Humanity had always been looked down upon by the galactic empire that ruled the stars. Humans were considered weak and primitive. Even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy dismissed them as little more than a nuisance to their grand plans. No one could have predicted that it would be the quietest and most unassuming species that would ultimately rise up and change the balance of the universe forever. The Raxian fleet had arrived on Earth under the guise of peace. Their ships were magnificent, towering metal behemoths, designed to awe and intimidate the humans below. To establish dominance with sheer spectacle, they made their presence known through waves of energy that crackled across the atmosphere, turning day to night. As their mothership descended from the sky with a thunderous roar across the plains of Texas, where they landed, the ground trembled beneath their colossal weight. The humans in the vicinity were paralyzed by fear and disbelief. But they did not panic. Instead, they looked up at the ships and wondered why the invaders had chosen them. The Raxians had faced wars with species far more advanced than the humans ever could hope to be, and their military might was second to none. The commanders of the Raxian fleet believed that their arrival on Earth was nothing more than a formality, a simple display of power. Before they would take control of this primitive world and its resources, they will extract everything they needed and leave nothing behind that could pose a future threat. But what the Raxians didn't understand was the quiet resilience that flowed through the veins of humanity. Colonel Sarah Carter stood at the front of the group of soldiers that had been assembled to assess the situation. She was an officer in the U.S. military, but her presence there wasn't what mattered most. The key was that she had spent her life fighting for humanity, not for a flag, not for an empire, but for the people who had always believed in their own survival. Even when the odds seemed insurmountable, she had seen it time and time again, how humans could rally together when there was no other choice, how they could dig deeper than any other species could comprehend when survival was at stake. She knew the truth: the Raxians had underestimated them. The humans didn't rely on technology as the Raxians did. They didn't have ships as powerful or weapons as deadly. But what they had was a gift that no one else in the galaxy had ever truly understood. They had the ability to adapt, the ability to endure beyond reason, to rise from the ashes time and time again. And the quiet defiance of the human spirit was something the Raxians would never expect. The Raxians stood tall, their eyes scanning the horizon as they prepared to make their demands known to the humans. Their leader, the Supreme Commander Kalthar, addressed the gathered military forces from above, his voice booming across the plains. He told them that the Earth was now under the dominion of the Galactic Empire, and that resistance would be futile. He promised to leave them their lives in exchange for submission. They would become nothing more than a mining world stripped of their resources, but allowed to live in peace under the protection of the Empire. But Sarah Carter was no ordinary soldier. She stood still, her gaze never leaving the towering form of Kalthar. And as the commander spoke of the Empire's superiority, she silently activated a small device in her hand, a device that had been developed in secret, something the Raxians never even knew existed, a human weapon designed to break their arrogance and make them realize that even the most unassuming species had the power to fight back. As Sarah Carter's finger pressed the hidden button, the device sent out a low hum, a signal that pulsed through the air, unnoticed by the towering Raxians, but not by the humans who had been waiting for this moment for years. The signal was a simple one, yet devastatingly powerful. It was a frequency that could disrupt the sophisticated communication systems of the Raxian fleet. It had been a project born in the quietest corners of Earth's defense network. The humans had always known that their survival depended on more than just weapons. It was their ability to think outside the bounds of conventional warfare, to adapt when all seemed lost, and to turn the tide when the enemy least expected it. The first sign that something had gone wrong came when Kalthar's communication device flickered, and then went silent. His commanding voice was cut off mid-sentence, and confusion rippled through the ranks of the Raxian soldiers, who began to look at each other uncertainly. For a brief moment, the Raxians were vulnerable, as their most advanced systems failed them one by one. The satellites orbiting Earth blinked out of existence, and their massive warships faltered in midair. Without their usual precision, their movements became erratic, as their advanced targeting systems lost the connection to their mothership. Sarah saw the flicker of surprise in Kalthar's eyes, and knew that the tide had begun to shift. The humans on the ground still faced overwhelming odds, but they had gained a precious moment to act and act. They did. The soldiers who had been paralyzed by fear moments before now moved with purpose. They were far from the best trained or the best equipped, but the truth was they were the best at fighting for something they loved and would die to protect. They took to their positions, firing into the air to signal the other units to move forward. Their quick response was a testament to years of preparation. They had never stopped training. They had never stopped believing that their moment would come, even when the galaxy had turned its back on them. Colfer's eyes narrowed as he realized that something was happening, something he had not foreseen. He motioned to his lieutenants to activate their countermeasures, but even as they rushed to respond, it became clear that the humans had done the unthinkable. They had managed to breach their systems, and now the Raxian fleet was as vulnerable as any enemy they had ever faced. Back on the ground, Sarah's heart raced as she watched the chaos unfold before her. It was working, but she knew this was only the beginning of the fight. The true test would be whether humanity could capitalize on this fleeting advantage, or whether they would fall apart under the pressure of the galactic might that still loomed over them. Colfer's voice came through again, though this time it was not his usual commanding tone, but a desperate call for backup. The signal was weak, barely making it through the interference caused by Sarah's device, but it was enough to reach his command center back on the mothership. As he stood there facing the humans below, he finally saw the human spirit in full force. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting back, and not just with weapons, but with their hearts, with their ingenuity, and most importantly, with a deep-rooted will to preserve their way of lives, something that the Raxians could never truly understand. As the Raxian forces began to regroup, Sarah gave the signal for her unit to advance, and within moments, the first wave of human soldiers began to rush forward, moving with a speed and confidence that stunned the invaders. They were no longer a defeated species, they were a species with a plan, and they were determined to see it through no matter the cost. The ground beneath Sarah's boots seemed to hum with the energy of her heartbeat as she led her squad toward the Raxian positions. Her mind raced through the 1,000 calculations that had led to this moment. Each step took them closer to the enemy lines, closer to the center of their command. The humans had always relied on speed and surprise when their backs were against the wall, and today they would do it again, even without the advantage of numbers or technology. They were determined to make the Raxians regret underestimating them. Colfer's forces scrambled in disarray. Their massive warships were slowly regaining control of their systems, but they were not prepared for the speed and ferocity of the human counterattack. The first wave of soldiers had been a diversion, a small unit designed to buy time for the real assault. As Sarah's team advanced, they dropped to the ground and blended with the terrain, using the elements to their advantage. They had no choice but to use what they knew, and that meant exploiting the weaknesses in the Raxian strategy. The humans had learned much over the past decades. Their intelligence networks had been feeding them key information about the Raxian fleets, and while they had never stood a chance against their sheer might, they had learned to exploit the smallest openings to create the largest gaps. The Raxians had relied too much on their technology, and not enough on their adaptability. They thought themselves invincible, but they had forgotten one thing about humanity that was about to come back to haunt them. It wasn't just their weapons or tactics that made humans dangerous, it was their ability to work together and communicate when it mattered most. Sarah and her squad were part of a larger network of soldiers and civilians who had prepared for this day. The underground resistance groups that had spent years gathering supplies, building up resistance cells, and training in the art of war had been waiting for the right moment, and when it came, they struck with the precision of a species that knew its survival depended on it. Colfer's fleet was still disoriented, but now that the humans had mobilized, the true scope of their plan began to unfold. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, like a tightrope stretched to its breaking point. All it would take was one misstep, and everything they had fought for would be lost. But the human spirit was not one that could easily be broken. They had faced impossible odds before, and had always found a way to fight back. The sound of gunfire echoed across the plains as Sarah's team moved in closer to the Raxian command center. They had breached the perimeter, and were now inside the defensive grid. Every step took them further into the heart of the alien operation. Sarah could hear the frantic orders being barked by the Raxian commanders, the sound of their weapons charging and discharging, but none of it deterred her. The humans were not afraid of noise. They had learned to fight in the chaos, to thrive in the face of destruction. As they neared the central command hub, Sarah signaled her team to prepare for the final push. They had one shot at this, and if they failed, the Raxians would regain control of the situation. But if they succeeded, they would cripple the Empire's hold on Earth and send a message to the rest of the galaxy that humanity would not be an easy conquest. A low rumble shook the ground as the remaining Raxian warships fired off in rapid succession, their weapons turned toward the advancing humans. But it was too late. Sarah had already reached the heart of the command center. She could see the massive console that controlled the entire fleet. Her hands moved swiftly over the controls. As she prepared to initiate the final sequence, the Raxians would never see it coming. Sarah's fingers flew over the console. As she bypassed the Raxian security protocols, her breath steady, her mind focused. She had prepared for this moment her entire life. But nothing could have truly prepared her for the weight of what she was about to do. The console before her pulsed with the alien technology that ran the Raxian fleet. It was an intricate maze of systems and layers, each one more complex than the last. But Sarah was unshaken. This was her moment, and she would not fail. Behind her, the rest of her team spread out, covering all angles as they fought off the remaining Raxian soldiers who had rallied to defend the command center. Each blast from their weapons felt like a thunderclap in Sarah's chest. But she couldn't afford to be distracted. The time to act was now. The Raxians had already begun rerouting reinforcements to the area, but they were still too disoriented by the earlier disruption to mount an effective counterattack. The next few minutes would determine the fate of Earth. As Sarah worked to break through the final layer of the Raxian encryption, the screen in front of her flashed with a sudden warning alert. A secondary security system had activated and was quickly attempting to lock her out. The Raxians had anticipated sabotage, but they hadn't accounted for human ingenuity. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she accessed a hidden backdoor left in the system by a hacker long ago. This was a vulnerability that had been discovered during the early days of the Resistance, a crack in the Raxian Empire's armor, and now it was her weapon to use. The hum of the machinery around her grew louder as the breach deepened, and Sarah's pulse quickened. The moment of truth was closing in. She had no illusions about what this would cost her. If she failed, not only would Earth fall, but the Raxians would make an example of her to the rest of humanity. There was no going back. Once the final command was given, no second chances, only a single act that would either cripple the Empire or seal the fate of her people. Status report, she whispered to herself as she accessed the final command layer. The device's progress bar inched closer to completion. Her team was holding their ground, but the pressure was mounting. Sarah could hear the sound of Raxian reinforcements arriving outside their makeshift stronghold. The metallic stomp of their armored boots reverberated through the walls. The situation was getting worse with each passing second. But she couldn't let that deter her. She couldn't let fear creep in. Not now, not when she was so close. With one final keystroke, Sarah entered the override command, and the screen before her blinked once, twice, then displayed a flashing green indicator. Her heart skipped a beat. It was done. She had breached the central control systems of the Raxian fleet. The entire armada was now in her hands, or more accurately, in the hands of humanity. For the first time since the Raxians had arrived, Earth's fate was no longer in their hands, but in the hands of the people they had once dismissed as insignificant. A loud crash echoed from the hallway outside as the door to the command center was blasted open. The Raxians had finally arrived in force, and they were not pleased. Sarah could hear their growls, their deep alien voices reverberating through the door as they charged into the room, their weapons raised, their armor gleaming with deadly intent. But Sarah didn't flinch. She stepped back from the console and raised her own weapon. "This is where your empire ends," Sarah said, her voice steady, but filled with the power of generations who had fought for survival and won. The Raxian soldiers stormed into the command center, their armored forms filling the doorway, their weapons raised and ready to strike. But Sarah stood firm, her back straight, as her team held the line behind her, each soldier prepared to defend the small victory they had earned. but even in the face of overwhelming numbers, Sarah knew they had the advantage now, not in firepower, but in control. The Raxian fleet was at their mercy, and the soldiers were about to realize that humanity had something far stronger than advanced technology, a will to survive and a mind capable of outwitting any threat. Coltha's voice crackled through a communication channel, a last desperate order for his forces to crush the human resistance. But Sarah had already disabled their primary communications network. The Raxians were blind and deaf to the command of their supreme leader. The fleet was now a scattered mess of disoriented warships. With no central coordination, no unified strategy, they had been reduced to nothing more than floating targets. And for the first time, since the Raxians arrived on Earth, it was the humans who controlled the battlefield. One of Sarah's squad members shouted a warning as the Raxians advanced, their weapons humming with deadly energy. But Sarah's mind was already racing. She knew they couldn't hold this position forever, not against the sheer strength of the Raxian forces. But they didn't need to hold it, they only needed to survive long enough for the fleet to fall apart, and for the humans to take back control of their world. "Stay focused," Sarah shouted to her team. "We're almost there, just keep them occupied, and don't let them reach the console." The squad moved into position swiftly, their rifles raised as they took aim at the oncoming soldiers. They fired in synchronized bursts, each shot aimed at the weakest points in the Raxian armor. The humans were not equipped with the same devastating technology, but they had learned to fight like predators, on a hunt. Every shot counted, every movement deliberate. They were playing to their strengths, and the Raxians were beginning to realize that their strength was no longer enough. The air crackled with the sound of laser fire as the Raxians returned fire, their energy beams illuminating the room in brilliant flashes of blue and green. But Sarah and her team were quick, their movements fluid, their bodies trained to react before the threat even materialized. They ducked and rolled between cover, never allowing the Raxians to get a clean shot as they fired back with deadly precision. And as the exchange continued, Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the console. It was still active, the override was still in place, and with every passing second Sarah knew the window for a counterattack was closing for the Raxians. The longer they waited, the more control humanity would gain over the fleet, and soon the entire invasion force would be useless, stranded in space, with no means to coordinate their assault. Coltha's frustration was palpable over the comms, his voice no longer the booming, authoritative tone, but a mixture of anger and disbelief. As his forces failed to break the human line, he issued orders to activate their last resort, a self-destruct sequence, in the event of a failed mission. But Sarah anticipated this move. As well, she had prepared for every contingency, every countermeasure. She knew the Raxians would sacrifice their own fleet before they let it fall into enemy hands. Prepared to disengage, Sarah called to her team, "We need to move now, before they blow everything." The squad responded without hesitation. They began pulling back toward the back exit of the command center, moving quickly and efficiently as the Raxians grew more desperate and less coordinated, their movements slowing down. As they lost focus, the human soldiers could feel the shift in the air. The once imposing alien force was now faltering, and the momentum was shifting in favor of the people who had always been underestimated. Sarah reached the back of the room just as the first Raxian soldier breached the command center's threshold, but it was too late. The humans were already pulling back, the console systems were fully compromised, and as Sarah activated the final sequence, she saw the results reflected in the Raxian fleet's energy levels plummeting across the planet's orbit. A signal was sent to every ship, every craft in the fleet, instructing them to disengage or face destruction from within. The Raxians had lost the battle before they even knew it was over. The moment Sarah activated the final sequence, the room lit up with a blinding flash as the Raxian fleet began to crumble under the weight of its own failures. The system override was complete, and the self-destruct signals had been sent to every single ship in orbit. The Raxians were powerless to stop it, their once mighty armada now vulnerable and fragile, like a house of cards on the verge of collapse. Outside the command center, the sound of Raxian weapons continued to reverberate through the hallways, but Sarah knew that it didn't matter anymore. The battle was shifting from the ground to the skies. The humans had taken control of the heart of the invasion, and the enemy was now scrambling to understand what had just happened. They had never known fear like this before. A species that had been so confident in their superiority had been blindsided by the sheer audacity of humanity's resolve. Colfer's voice crackled through the comms again, but it was no longer the commanding presence it once was. It was laced with panic and disbelief. His orders came in a frantic jumble as his fleet began to suffer massive system failures. One by one, the Raxian warships began to drift aimlessly in orbit. As their power systems shut down, they were completely at the mercy of the humans who had outsmarted them at every turn. Sarah and her team moved quickly through the corridors, the sounds of battle still raging behind them, but the Raxian resistance was now a shadow of its former self. They had lost their command structure, they had lost their ability to coordinate, and most importantly, they had lost their fearlessness. Without their technology, without their communication network, they were nothing more than soldiers on the ground, just like the humans they had once considered beneath them. As they reached the exit of the facility, Sarah paused for just a moment, her mind racing with the gravity of what had just happened. The Raxian fleet was collapsing, but there was still work to be done. She knew that the victory wasn't complete until the invaders were completely driven off Earth and humanity had secured its place in the stars. "Move out," Sarah ordered as she led the team into the open. The sky above was dark with the presence of the remaining Raxian ships still hovering ominously, but they were now vulnerable. They were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. They were now just another enemy to be defeated. The humans didn't celebrate yet. They had no time for that, not when the battle was still raging across the planet. They needed to rally the resistance forces, the cities that had been hiding underground, the military units that had been waiting for this moment. Now they would strike in full force, and they would finish what they had started. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had irrevocably turned as the first human reinforcements began to appear from their hidden bases all across the world. The Raxian soldiers who remained on the ground began to falter as they realized the extent of their situation. They had no command, no hope of victory, and nowhere to retreat. To the Earth had been reclaimed by its rightful owners. Sarah looked toward the sky again. The Raxian warships still hovered, but she knew that it was only a matter of time before the rest of their fleet would begin to fall apart. Each second that passed now worked in humanity's favor. The final pieces of the Empire were being torn away bit by bit, and soon they would have nothing left to fight for. As the first wave of human fighters appeared in the sky, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe, a moment to recognize that against all odds they had won, but she knew better than anyone that the true test was still ahead of them. They had defeated one empire, but there were others out there in the galaxy watching, waiting to see if humanity's fire would burn out, or if it would rise again to become something far greater than anyone had ever imagined. The sky above Earth began to brighten as the last remnants of the Raxian fleet faltered and drifted into nothingness. The hum of their warships was replaced by the roar of human jets cutting through the atmosphere, the clouds breaking apart as the first wave of reinforcements arrived and began their assault on the remaining ground forces below. The invasion was coming to a close, but the battle for Earth's future was just beginning. Sarah stood amidst the chaos, her breath still steady, but her mind racing. She knew this wasn't the end of the war. It was only the beginning. They had struck a blow that would be felt across the galaxy, but the universe was vast, and the Raxian Empire wasn't the only threat humanity would face. They had only proven they were capable of surviving the impossible. Now, they would have to prove they could thrive in a galaxy full of dangers they couldn't even imagine yet. The air crackled with the energy of battle as human soldiers moved in to mop up the remaining Raxian forces, their weapons and tactics now far more effective than they had been just hours before. The Raxians were scattered, their formations were in disarray, and without leadership, they were falling one by one to the onslaught of humanity's retribution, each victory more significant than the last as the invaders were forced to retreat or be neutralized. Sarah could see the tide turning from the vantage point of the battlefield. She watched as a group of Raxian soldiers attempted to regroup behind a destroyed building, only to be outflanked by a squad of human marines. They were fast and efficient, their movements a perfect example of what humanity had become in this war. They were no longer helpless survivors, they were fighters, they were warriors capable of standing toe-to-toe with the greatest armies in the galaxy. Coltha's fleet had all but disintegrated now. The remaining ships were either incapacitated or drifting aimlessly without direction. They had no power, no command, and no hope. Sarah's heart raced as she looked at the sky one last time. The largest of the Raxian warships, the flagship that had hovered ominously above them, all now hung in the atmosphere like a carcass. It was a grotesque symbol of the Raxian Empire's arrogance, its pride shattered in a single moment. But there was no time to savor the victory. As human forces began to coordinate, a final sweep of the planet Earth's recovery had to begin now. The cities and towns that had been ravaged during the invasion needed to be rebuilt. The people who had suffered under the Raxian rule needed to be cared for. The war had taken its toll on the world and its people, but it had also awakened something in humanity, a realization that they were not alone in the universe, and that they were capable of far more than anyone had ever expected. Sarah's mind shifted to the future. What did this victory mean for the world? What did it mean for humanity's place in the stars as they moved forward from this moment? Would they become the conquerors or the protectors? She didn't have the answers. But she knew one thing for certain: they had proven they could face down the greatest threats the galaxy had ever known. And they would not stop there. They would build something new, a new era for Earth, and for humanity, something that would stand tall against any who dared to challenge them. A voice interrupted her thoughts, breaking through the tension that had built up over the past hours. It was one of her squad members calling out to her. They had gathered in the center of the battlefield waiting for her orders. "Colonel Carter, the last Raxian stronghold has been taken. We're securing the area," the soldier said. Sarah nodded, her eyes still focused on the horizon, where the last of the Raxian ships were disappearing into the vastness of space. She turned to her team and said what needed to be said. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "We've shown the galaxy what we can do, and now we're going to show them who we are." The last of the Raxian forces were driven back into the wreckage of their shattered strongholds. Across the planet, Sarah watched from a hilltop as humanity's forces cleared the remaining pockets of resistance. It was surreal. The air was filled with the heavy scent of burning debris. But there was a quiet peace settling over the battlefield, the kind that came only after a storm had passed. The sound of distant explosions had faded, and all that remained were the voices of the victorious soldiers calling out in unity, their presence more than just a symbol of survival, but a promise of what Earth had become. The sky above was beginning to shift from dark to light, the rising sun piercing the horizon and casting its first rays over the smoldering remains of what had been an invasion force that never stood a chance, not when it was up against the heart and will of humanity. The Raxians had made the mistake of believing they were superior, but they had underestimated something far more dangerous than technology or firepower: the unyielding spirit of a species determined to defend its home. Sarah stood still for a moment, letting the cold wind whip through her hair as her mind wandered back to the chaos of the past hours, the decisions she had to make, the lives lost and saved. But there was something else, something that was rising within her, a deep sense of pride, but also a sharp realization that this victory was a harbinger of greater challenges to come. Earth had proven it could withstand invasion. But what about the galaxy? What about the other species that had watched from the sidelines? Would they now view humanity as a rising power or a threat? Behind her, a loud cheer erupted as human forces cleared the last of the Raxian fighters, and their banners were raised. The victory was complete. The world had been reclaimed, and it was time for humanity to rebuild. But there was little time for celebration. Sarah knew they would need to move fast to stabilize the planet, to bring order and heal the scars left by the war. The infrastructure was shattered, governments had crumbled, and millions of lives had been affected. But they had the strength to recover. They always did. A small voice broke through her reverie. One of her soldiers approached with a look of exhaustion, but also of hope in his eyes. "Colonel Carter, the leaders from the resistance networks are ready to meet. They've asked for you to join them," he said. Sarah nodded without hesitation. Her place was with the people who had fought alongside her, and beside them, she would lead the next phase of the struggle for peace, the struggle for Earth's future. As they made their way to the rendezvous point, the echoes of the past few days still rang in her ears, the screams of battle, the chaos, the loss, and the triumph. But she couldn't linger on the past, not now, not when everything had changed, not when humanity had just proven it was no longer a species to be dismissed or enslaved. The council meeting was set up in an old underground bunker, one of the last remaining safe zones, where the leaders of the scattered resistance groups had gathered in secret during the invasion. It was a symbol of humanity's unity in the face of impossible odds, a reminder that when the world was on the brink of destruction, it was the people who had fought to protect it. Inside the room, the mood was somber, but filled with purpose. Sarah stood at the front, looking at the faces of the leaders who had helped guide humanity through its darkest days. They were battered but unbowed, and now they were ready to begin a new chapter. Today we've shown the galaxy what we're capable of, Sarah began, her voice steady and commanding. But this is only the first step. We've taken down a long road, and we have to walk it together. If we want to ensure our survival, we need to rebuild. But we also need to prepare for the next challenge. We've made our mark. But the universe is a vast place full of dangers we've only begun to understand, and now we have to face them head-on. The room was silent for a moment, as everyone absorbed her words. The weight of what lay ahead settling in. The war with the Raxians had ended, but the war for Earth's place in the galaxy was just beginning. We will rise again, Sarah continued, her eyes fierce with resolve. And we'll show the universe that humanity isn't just a species that survives, we're a species that thrives.